This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the business psychos and does not reflect the viewpoints of their current or former employers or clients. Thank you.
It's the business psychos, and today we're gonna talk it out. The podcast about what execs shouldn't talk about. Connecting executives and those who aspire. We're here to have a conversation, yeah, we're gonna light the fire. It's the business psychos. Yeah. The business psychos.
Oh my God, that's funny.
I'm going to repeat it.
You won't get the shock and awe from me, though.
I know, but I'm going to repeat it
part
anyway.
Of it is the reaction.
All right, everyone, this is a public service announcement, Katie. Yeah. That's what I'm doing here. This is not for you. This is for our listeners. So stop making it about you. Listeners, I was just talking to Katie before we started to roll that my ear, nose, and throat doctor told me today that my ears were too clean. I know you all were very curious.
Yeah,
but you're not supposed to clean your ears too often because the wax serves as a protective barrier. So
a functional barrier.
You know, the more you know.
A functional barrier.
Functional barrier.
That's really great.
We're going to start to drop these little pearls of wisdom into the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think getting free medical advice is, it's another value add.
Yeah, she was awesome. Dr. King in Chinatown, thank you. She's brilliant.
As mentioned previously, I, not necessarily on the pod, but I used to call on ENTs, and they're really great doctors. Because it's actually like what they cover is like your head, except with everything, not your brain. And maybe your eyes too. A little bit of sinus related to that. There's a lot going on in there. A lot of tubes. And functionalities.
Yeah. Well, I lost my sense of smell about 20 years ago. And
what?
I have from chronic sinus problems, and it's like the nerve apparently the smell nerves are right here in your body. And if you burn them out, they don't regenerate. And I did acupuncture. I tried, but it's something like 75%. We'll have to fact check this. 75% of your taste is contingent on having smell. So like it is a big quality of life issue and also a little bit of a health issue because I've gotten like food sickness sometimes. Like I've gotten like bad food's gone off and I couldn't smell it. And all right, well, yeah. I mean that's like a protective measure of like.
Is it a functional barrier?
All right. The moment we're starting this off on kind of like a gross, a little sassy today, Katie. We're a little sassy today.
We're like, what is it? In England, they have those TV shows that are like gross and embarrassing bodies.
Disgusting bodies.
I
lived in the UK. I lived in London for a couple of years. And it's like, it would go on at 9:00 at night and there would be like, this full nudity. Like, I guess the deal is, again, someone can fact check this. So we'll just talk about like, they have this like mobile medical van that goes around and like you get free, work, even though they have NHS there, but like you go be seen by a doctor, but then of course you have to be filmed, consent to having your self videoed. And sometimes it's like, I've got this giant pustule on this part of my body. And then, and it's like, what is it? And it's supposed to like, destigmatize talking about these things and like, hey, a lot of people, especially men, don't look at things, or if it's embarrassing or scary, people don't get it checked out. And so a good show.
Oh, you're right, because it did have nudity. I mean, that was part of the shock, is it would just be like the great reveal to the person sitting there completely nude with like, I
think it's 9:00 there. They have a different. You okay over there in Boston, Katie?
They're coming for me. Yeah, they heard. This is where there's actually a lot of vigilance here about like earwax. So I think I got
All right.
They picked me up on the
This
scanner.
is clearly not a safe space for me to talk about
It's totally
vulnerable
safe.
issues.
It's totally
microaggressions aside.
It's a microaggression. It really, like, honestly, I think that it's like having a pristine ear canal is just, a very lovely notion. So, but I get it. You've taught me something. It's important.
You're
Those are
welcome.
important things. We're a show about important things. We have no, like, that's actually, I think, what our tagline should be: a show about important things.
Just keep it simple.
Yeah.
Keep it simple. But we're talking about something important today, I think.
Yeah. What is it? Talk to me. What are we doing? Oh boy. Are we doing it? Are we going to actually do this?
We're doing
dare?
It. I think so.
Dare?
I mean...
All right. Well, if you say so, I think if we're going to kind of open up and, sort of talk about earwax, why not talk about the second most shocking taboo, which is, stay tuned. All right. So on today's episode, we are tackling a major issue companies are facing: employee retention. As it's more commonly known, job hopping. Keeping talent isn't just about avoiding turnover. It's about keeping the knowledge that drives innovation, solves problems faster, and makes everything run smoother. A stable team boosts morale, builds healthier cultures, and creates stronger collaboration, all of which lead to happier customers and fewer costly mistakes. And let's be real, high turnover is expensive. Recruiting, training, and lost productivity all add up. So if retention is so valuable, why are people leaving faster than ever? Let's dig into what's really going on.
Katie, I know it's going to be hard for you to believe this, but I'm Gen X.
No.
I know.
I thought you were Alpha.
Yeah. Well, I am Alpha, but I'm not Gen Alpha. All right. Sassy. All right. So I grew up with parents and grandparents who would be working age between 1950 and 1970, which is why I think my idea of working is from that era, right? I'm growing up and watching adults work in that era. And what are the hallmarks of these decades, you're asking? Well, this is the time of the job for life years. It was common for Americans to work for one company for most, if not the entirety, of their careers. This was especially true in manufacturing, automotive, and industrial sectors. Career stability equated to a successful life. This is when the middle class exploded in the US. Unions, especially in the areas I just mentioned, flourished, which led to wage increases, better job security, career advancement, and stability. Companies rewarded and competed for employees with generous pensions, health insurance, and retirement plans, which then further incentivized long-term tenure. Companies held a paternalistic role, creating an unwritten employer-employee social contract. Workers were expected to ascend over time based on seniority and experience. And while many jobs still required long hours, there was a clear separation between personal and professional lives, because remember, these were the days before computers, no less mobile phones. And while there were still very extreme divides for genders, the benefits I've just mentioned applied to both white and blue-collar jobs.
As you mentioned, the generation before ours experienced like more of a sense of mutual obligation between employers and employees. One thing to consider is that the stability was often limited to certain groups, primarily white men, and also
spoiler alert. Sorry.
There were two groups. It was white men and white men that were experiencing these benefits. So, women, people of color, and other marginalized groups were systematically excluded from the most stable, high paying jobs. I mean, still, even when they were allowed in, and by they, I mean we were allowed in, we faced discriminatory pay and limited opportunities for advancement. So while some workers enjoyed long-term job security, it wasn't a universal experience. This traditional dynamic of the paternalistic relationship role that companies played, not often discussed, is how this held up certain societal structures that would carry through the 70s, all the way till when there were disruptions in the workforce, that began to emerge then. The US economy began to face structural challenges and economic competition from new global players, thinking about like the end of the 70s, early 80s. And another disruptor was the social movements like civil rights and women's liberation, which started to challenge traditional workplace demographics and dynamics. So globalization and economic challenges hit hard in the 80s and 90s. Not to mention the impact of Milton Friedman economics, which were emphasizing and granting permission to value the shareholder over the stakeholder, meaning profits over people, aka trickle down economics, creating more intense pressure for profits. So this led to cost cutting exercises like downsizing, restructuring, layoffs, which began to occur more often. As a result, the long-term job stability defined in earlier generations started to wane. Other measures such as outsourcing, offshoring, and shifting to contract workers, it just became more commonplace. And by these recent decades, factors such as the gig economy started with the rise of more flexible, temporary, part-time, and freelance work. As a result, workers began to move between companies more often.
Yeah, and then you bring in tech, right, in the 90s and 2000s, and now you see more changing tenure patterns, right? Because the fast-paced nature of tech and change ended up leading to more frequent job changes as workers move between startups and established companies, seeking higher wages and more appealing benefits. Corporate loyalty further diminishes as workers seek better opportunities. And I think the main industries we're thinking about here is tech, finance, and some of the creative industries. So now it's normal, right? Fast forward, for people to change jobs every 2 to 5 years. And in the last 15 years, tenure norms shift even more as Millennial and Gen Z workers come into the workforce. Workers from these groups value flexibility, work-life balance, and remote work. Unlike earlier generations, they identify less with their jobs and don't include brand prestige as a consideration. Instead, they're more focused on company values, culture, and social responsibility programs. So all of this said, Americans are feeling more pressure to thrive financially, and job instability adds to that stress. Companies, meanwhile, are frustrated by loss of institutional knowledge, quiet quitting, and modern worker expectations. So what does this all mean for companies and employees? Is it possible for us to all work together, and can't we all get along? So there's a lot to break down here for both employers and for employees. So let's start the conversation. Hang tight, psychos. We'll be right back. I've always found the idea of staying at a company for a long time appealing. In retrospect, I think my over-identification with work played into this. If I'm honest, I can even see times when I was starting out where I projected the family construct onto my work life a little bit. That being said, even children grow up and leave home at some point, right? Well, they're supposed to. I started my career at two of the largest and most successful companies in New York, Tiffany's and New York University. Both were founded in the 1830s, just like gonna blow some people's minds, and had no shortage of employees with double-digit tenure. In fact, I worked with a colleague at NYU in the 90s who's still there and has over 50 years with the university. That's like just insane.
Whoa.
Shout out to Steve.
Wow,
I
Steve,
might have
go
stayed
Steve.
and very happy and very, very much ingrained. And you can imagine the institutional knowledge over 50 years, right?
Yeah.
He's a wonderful guy. But you're not going to find that anymore. That's obsolete. I might have stayed at Tiffany's the rest of my career if I hadn't been headhunted by a top tier consulting firm. Their first offer was 75% increase to my salary. So it was like a no-brainer there. But I love the firm. Consulting felt like the best of both worlds. You cycle through projects at different clients, but you still have your core family that stays a constant. And without going down a rabbit hole about consulting, I'll say that there are a number of career paths. And as I was growing quickly, none of them at the time really seemed to appeal to me in exactly the right way. So I started my own consultancy business and went happily off on my own. As a change expert, I am somewhat allergic to rote, repetitive kinds of work. New puzzles to solve excite me, and I love being forced to continually learn and solve new problems. It was interesting to see the workforce dynamics at large organizations where there were both long tenured employees as well as those who had joined like last week. And in my experience, this often creates like almost microcultures and inter-cohort dynamics. Like sometimes a board will make a sweeping leadership change at the top of the house, which results in widespread leadership changes, which end up trickling down across the organization. And then what happens? Well, leaders bring in their trusted people, their friends that they've worked with throughout their career. And those people then bring in their people and so on and so on. It's not uncommon for the folks who've been at an organization a really long time to experience these changes with fear and even anger. I've heard terms like corporate invaders used. No one wants someone outside the family coming into their house and changing how things are done. Conversely, the new folks, armed with their marching orders from new leadership, are often heard to say things like, well, this is how we did it at, enter whatever company name there.
Yeah.
The subtext screams, you guys have been here too long admiring these problems. I come from a place where we already solved them years ago, in fact. Step aside, you're part of the problem, and I'm here as the solution. Well, you can imagine how well that plays out. As a change practitioner, this is all fascinating stuff, and we can do an entire podcast on how these types of dynamics can undermine complex change and transformation initiatives. But I guess my point here is that in terms of retaining talent and keeping talent fresh, there's a sweet spot to be found. And the same holds true for employees. If you bounce around too much, you'll likely not benefit from lessons which only come over time. And your brand will suffer as recruiters worry that you have commitment or performance problems.
We did a 2-part episode on shame in our first season, and I think it's worth considering how shame gets embedded in so-called like standards of a career. I can remember early in my career when a lot of jumps or hops on a resume would lower a candidate's market value. Now there's a case to be made that demonstration of rapid ascension and multiple logos on your LinkedIn increase your appeal versus a candidate with over a decade in one company with like 1 or 2 promotions, previously normal. It's seen as lacking, the virtues of like hustle, ambition, and demonstration of growth. A lot of what we talk about on the show is, building a career iteratively by figuring out what works best for you. And this, at some point, is going to involve confronting some long-held standards that serve to fence you in. And stepping outside of them can be very scary. As you just outlined, Mary, a career can take many twists and turns. If you focus on setting yourself up to play in, games you can win versus buying into the narrative to tough it out in conditions that both suck and are conducive for your growth, where I think the long-term prospectus on that, like ultimately, it's kind of, you wind up figuring out it doesn't work when it's a little bit too late to be able to build a strategy, or at least, you're later in the game. So, to that point, I have a slightly different path. Early in my career, I started at Eli Lilly And when I left, people questioned my sanity. And to be fair, they were kind of right. I wasn't doing so hot. I mean, actually, episode 2, I actually made a series of decisions where I chose jobs where I was initially making, where I would ultimately initially make less money than the previous one. But I knew the conditions were increasingly better suited for me. I wanted to plant myself in soil where I could thrive, and I was learning to build my capability. I mean, one example of this is like moving from Eli Lilly to a smaller pharmaceutical company where I knew I could be more innovative, and then continuing to iterate off of that. And I won't go into all the details here in the interest of time, but I like to say that I'm the Gen Z prototype. I was working in Bali before it was a thing, leaving jobs to further self-actualize myself before that was a thing. And you know what? I'll speak for myself. It's, worked out pretty great.
And we'll be right back.
If you learn to trust yourself and bet on yourself, the capacity to take risks and build a life on your own terms, it builds over time. But be patient, brick by brick. Or if you remember What About Bob with Bill Murray, it's just all about taking baby steps.
Awesome movie. Great quote, by the way. Another
baby steps.
The best movie ever. If you haven't seen it, homework.
Oh my God. Everybody,
everyone must
stop what you're doing. Okay. So making decisions that make sense for you, but not others, it's not for the faint of heart. For example, oh my gosh. Yeah. For example, when I left Eli Lilly, I was having dinner with a family member and her partner at the Top of the Hub restaurant in Boston. Rest in peace to the institution. And when she left, she got up from the table to go use the restroom. Her partner looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm successful in business, and that is why I can see you don't have what it takes to succeed." And my response had been, "That's interesting that you consider yourself successful." And also, side note, not to say that was actually something that felt good. I'm sassy, but it was also kind of just like, Jesus. And a side note to that story is their hatred of me had just been sparked because I had called them out for mistreating the server. And they literally said, "Do you know who I am?" When the server walked away, amongst other things. And when the server walked away, I told them both, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't point out that what you just did was so uncalled for.
And you all ate a lot of saliva in that meal.
Right? By association, I was probably stuck in the spit train, headed for Spit Town and a suburb of Spit Philadelphia. So, and but now that I think about it, recalling that this same person many years later used my success to shame someone else, in a pattern as old and predictable as time itself. We were sitting around a table and he told someone, and this is paraphrased, he said to someone, he goes, "This is why you don't have what it takes to be successful like Katie." And look, I'm bringing up this example because it's important to remember that people who don't believe in you and express it without any constructive content are just showing you their own festering wounds and has nothing to do with you. If someone who knows you cares for you says, "Hey, I think this is an area where you would struggle because of XYZ, and here are my thoughts on an alternative or a workaround," that's interesting to me. If you only have the vision to point out faults, but not to recognize like recognize opportunity or be interested in putting some elbow grease in to, support me, I'm checking your receipts. And if you are not more successful and happier than me, your perspective is handicapped accordingly.
What did you used to say if you don't have, I know this is a bigger quote, but you've said it before, which is like, if you don't take advice from someone whose life you don't want.
Don't take directions from somebody who's lost.
Right.
Like, that's my thing. And and the thing is people that are in the business of like enjoying giving advice, and actually I would say time has further like endowed me with conviction on this, is like my lack of interest in giving advice has like spiked in the more I've been qualified to give it, or even guidance or criticism or pointing out like you're doing it wrong or whatever. It's like, now I know, it's like if somebody's like air quotes doing it wrong, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of part of the process. Like,
Yes.
People are kind of figuring out their thing. And like the thing about like making mistakes, like going to the wrong job or, it's like, don't do that. It's like, yeah, you know what? Like I went to a lot of wrong jobs. I went through all that stuff. And so, as far as like feeling that just like viewing somebody at like one point in time, that you're in a position to like be able to like take, the sort of, interim captain role. I mean, it's,
it's like the therapy model, right? Like therapists don't give prescriptive advice, and yet there's so many, good ones anyway. But before, like, I'm having some thoughts, but like, first off, can we just say that like being shitty to servers or anyone working in service, I mean, it's just like a big non-negotiable for me. And this is coming from someone who has like extraordinary service expectations. Like there are contact center databases where I have like an asterisk next to my name, I'm sure. Oh I world-class operations, right? Like, so I know what's achievable. So I'm pretty volatile when those expectations aren't met, but it's not the server's fault when things aren't happening. I went to a lunch with a work colleague years ago, and she was so sweet. We were both in our 20s, and she, like, it was just like a totally different person. And she like berated the server repeatedly. I think she ordered like a hamburger, and she's like, no, that's not no. And they kept serving it. And then she's like, by that time I was like done. And she's like, no, I don't like it. It was, I wanted to die. So different in context to how she acted at work, and really the end of our relationship. We should do an episode on that too. But anyway, you're right. I think you're right, Katie. Career building, it's iterative, and there's self-searching in it. And then you change throughout this period of time too. And so every person, they're going to have their own risk threshold. And that's something which is going to change. If you're single without kids in your 20s and 30s, you can probably shoulder a little more risk that comes with, job hopping and work gaps. If you're in midlife, even without a family, maybe you're starting to evaluate your retirement strategy, but all of that's very, very, very personal. And I think you bring up a really good point about who you look to for advice. I mean, the answer, of course, is the business psychos. Kidding. Not a little bit. But your example, I think, shows how interpersonal dynamics will color perceptions and distort or even negate advice. So too will biases. So for example, I have a relatively conservative risk profile. So my advice is going to skew slightly that way. And then there's the bias, which comes from those who will be impacted by your decision, like to leave a job. So obviously having that conversation with your boss, it's a great example. Like, maybe you do have a really cool one who's able to be somewhat objective, and you go and say, hey, I really want to go here. I have a competing offer or whatever. And maybe they can be objective and wish you the best, but maybe not. So I think all of this is to say, take everything for a grain of salt. And by the way, there's like broader market considerations like the ones we've discussed previously. Starting your own business in a recession, maybe not a great idea, but a very personal, even though this is like a business podcast, we kind of go into this like kind of other spaces sometimes. And Like there's advice, and then there's like, to your point, like there's the journey. Like the right answer is in the mistake. Like you're not going to find the answer unless maybe you go through that. Like avoiding it isn't the answer.
Kind of wild. Side note. So I was in a sorority in college, and there's Hell Week, which is now, verboten. But it was like psychological torture, sleep deprivation, all sorts of head games. And I like when I went through Hell Week, I was like, you should meet my mother. You guys are weak.
Like I have a PhD in Hell Week.
Yeah, no, like they couldn't. Like the part of it is they're supposed to break you, and I just like wouldn't break. I'm like, listen, I studied with the masters. Like you guys can't like listen. You guys,
I would like, never. The Hell Week is why I would never, even in a million years, I would have considered.
See, this is actually something that's interesting. It's exactly why I want to do it.
Yeah,
I would be. What this is about. Let's see what you guys got. It's all games, so it was like like it's not positioned that way, but
seems like a lot of humiliation. Seems like there's like a lot of humiliation.
Oh yeah, it's like the attempt because they're trying to like do all sorts of dumb fake stuff. But after I became a sister, because then you participate in it, and I like had no interest in it. There were some, there was like a very significant subset of sisters that really enjoyed the process of being in the power seat for Hell Week. And so the pledge class that came after me, there was this one girl who was like just a broken puddle. She was a pledge. And I totally broke ranks and like supported her. And like had one-off conversations with her. You're not supposed to. Like it's actually like, no, you don't. And the thing that stuck with me for honestly decades afterwards was this same. I'm just gonna use her name. Her name is Cheryl. Fuck it, come get me, Cheryl.
Hey, Cheryl.
Yeah. No, get ready. Is that once she became a sister, she was one of the most vicious people in the room during Hell Week. As a formative, I was probably 19, 20 when that happened. For me, that was really formative to see that like very clear demonstration of how the cruelest people are the weakest and the strongest people are the kindest. And so it's like, even going back to that thing, it's like, if I see somebody, to your point, like you had a relationship that ends because somebody is like cruel because they have the upper hand in the power dynamic and absolutely just like use it to like just like kick the throttle into gear. It's like you just know something that is like that's like goes kind of bone spirit deep with the person. So I don't need to do like more exploration here.
You can't unsee it. You can't unsee it. And it's so character defining. It's so there are some things like, I mean, I've been an asshole. Like I've made mistakes. I've whatever, and I've either owned them then or soon after. I've apologized for things even years later. But then there are some things which are just so character defining.
Exactly.
Well,
it's an important point that when you're weak, when you need to have power over other people to feel powerful, you're a liability, for the emotional safety of other people. And so I don't like do this. I mean, it's coming off more as like more of a call out than I'd want it to be. But, when we're talking about people who are either A, being overtly cruel to people who are not in the position to fight back, or secondly, to people who are at like some point right now, like questioning, would this be selfish for me to do this thing, to invest in growing myself? That's my other part of this, which is like, absolutely not. Swing for the fences. Like your greatest version of yourself is like so extraordinary for the people in your community, the people around you, the people who love you, the people you work with. It's like, yes, I say yes, go for it.
Woo! This is heavy stuff. Go and grab a coffee. Hang tight. We'll be right back. The topic of tenure is a fascinating and topical one. There's no doubt that economics, politics, and technology have been major disruptors in terms of how companies handle their resources. Over the last 30, 40 years, there have been big cultural shifts between how companies treat employees, eradicating the post-war social contract, which once defined American workers' relationships with their employers. I've seen instances where long tenures have led to the intellectual atrophying of organizational talent. Narrowing perspectives aren't great for innovation, efficiency, or problem solving. But attrition can be just as detrimental. If organizations don't invest, nurture, and retain employees, and by retain, I don't mean bagels in the lunchroom and Wednesday afternoon pizza parties either. Retention strategies should include creating a stable job with clear promotion paths and training. This is done through proper workforce planning and skills management. Otherwise, organizations go through yo-yo hiring and firing cycles to improve optics prior to earning calls. This isn't ethical leadership. Employees aren't jet fuel to be dumped before landing. Lack of loyalty and the dehumanization of workers has consequences. So it should be no surprise that modern workers feel just in doing the bare minimum. Job hunting and even doing gig work at the same time as working full time. Personally, I don't think we're in a great place. I think we're going to see a reduction in innovation and reduced quality of goods and services. There are opportunities for organizations to develop ethical workforce models, which treat people well and lead to long-term growth and profitability. In my work, M-Schaub Advisory, I advise clients on how to create the infrastructure to do just this. I can't stress enough that this is not about people over profits. It's about running a business strategically, creating an environment where your employees and the business thrive together. But until we change the world, there are choices to be made around how you think about job tenure. For those in their 20s, I would advise against jumping too quickly from job to job. By the way, I would never recommend staying in a toxic situation. So if that's you, then definitely get working on finding something else. But adaptation, resiliency, and relationship building are crucial skills to master early on in your career. And if you change jobs too often, and I'm not putting in a number here, so that's, again, going back to, I'm not giving advice on what too often is. But if you don't stay at a place where you learn those skills, you're not going to master them. And by the way, no place is perfect. So you need to be self-aware of what your likes to haves versus your needs to have are, and be thoughtful about trade-offs. Mid and late career workers know that most companies are unable to offer job security. As you ascend up the ranks in seniority and comp, you'll face more competition for roles and be at greater risk for layoffs and demotions because you're more expensive than your junior counterparts. My recommendation is to keep your skills, resume, and LinkedIn profile fresh, and to institute regular networking both within and outside of your company. Give yourself a target of talking to a couple people every month. Ask people questions about their perspectives and seek feedback. People love giving feedback. And be polite and friendly and shine light on yourself too. There was a time when I felt awkward talking too much about my accomplishments. I grew up in a family where people just got on with things, and talking about yourself too much was viewed as impolite. If this is you, get over it fast. Put a note in your phone with a few bullets about your top 3 skills and 2 interesting projects where you applied them. Get comfortable sharing this information in a context where you're not looking for anything. This will be more important for building a brand and network whom you can call upon when you're ready to make your next move. And rather than job hunt when you're at the end of your rope and desperate to get out, or get a sense that layoffs are coming, consistently look at and apply to new opportunities. Do this all the time. Making decisions and interviewing when you're in a secure job always works in your favor. You're going to come across as more confident, and you'll be perceived as being more valuable to potential new employers than if you don't have a job. It's a good strategy for you to stay plugged into the most sought-after skills, benefits, and comp ranges. Go on interviews, be curious, ask questions, and practice talking about yourself. You never know what might happen. This is all to say, loyalty is something which should be earned. Take control of your career by staying relevant and informed and remaining open. This will keep you from getting too comfortable, which can result in the stagnation of skills, including those needed for interviewing. It'll also help you maintain visibility and an active pipeline of opportunities should the time come to move on. Feeling you have agency is going to improve your mental health too. Should you be let go by your company, you'll be 20 steps ahead and more emotionally prepared too. Alternatively, you might be in a good place today, but end up finding something even better. And if you decide then to jump to that better gig, guess what? Then you start the whole cycle again.
Thanks for tuning in. Did you find this episode interesting? Please take a moment to rate and review us on YouTube or your podcast platform of choice. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but ensures you never miss an episode. Plus, your support helps us reach more listeners and bring you even more great content. Oh, and don't keep the good stuff to yourself. Share the love by sending this episode to the folks in your life who might benefit from it. We love building our community and would be thrilled to have them join us. Can't get enough Business Psychos? Get news, behind-the-scenes content, and random commentary, not to mention pictures of Katie's cat, by following us on Instagram and Facebook at Business Psychos Pod. Thanks again for listening.